Hello, everyone, and welcome to our roundtable, The Pandemic 1 Year On. This virtual event has been organized by The Pathologist and is kindly supported by Assuragen. My name is Michael Schubert. I'm the editor of The Pathologist, and I'm joined by an esteemed panel of experts, including Adrian Wildfire, Director of Scientific and Business Strategy at HVivo. Adrian will be moderating today's discussion. We have Peter Openshaw, Professor of Experimental Medicine at Imperial College London, and a member of the UK government's New and Emerging Respiratory Virus Threats Advisory Group, Rebecca Cox, Professor of Medical Virology and Head of the Influenza Centre at the University of Bergen and Haukeland University Hospital in Norway, Daniel Hoft, Professor of Internal Medicine at St. Louis University School of Medicine, and Dennis Strenk, Pathologist Assistant at Wisconsin Diagnostic Laboratories and host of the People of Pathology podcast. So without further ado, let's get started. Adrian, over to you.
Thank you very much for the introduction, Michael. Okay, we're going to have a look at what's happened over the past year during this pandemic and the surprises that have come leaping out of the woodwork, how we've tackled those, lessons learned. But before we get into that, I just want to do a very quick introduction into what's happened in the history of this pandemic so far. And I'm just going to touch on a few points, just which I think will be relevant later. So this all started on the 31st of December 2019. There was a new virus noted, well, some pneumonias were noted. About 27 cases in Wuhan in China, southern China. It was pretty much excluded that this was MERS at the time. By the 8th of January, CDC had said they'd isolated novel coronavirus. We had a genome by the 24th of January. It was named COVID by the 11th of February by the WHO, and SARS-CoV-2, as is related to those beta coronaviruses we'd had previously, such as MERS and SARS. It seemed to accelerate fairly quickly. Second death by 14th of Feb in outside China. We had a cruise ship, 20th Feb, which gave us some very good data around transmission, IFR and CFRs. And I think that's when we first started noting these increased death rates compared to some of our normal upper respiratory tract infections and some of the weird symptoms we were seeing. By the 11th of March, of course, it had been declared a pandemic by the WHO. And by that point, it was probably too late, as we'd had Ischgl in the Austrian Tyrol region, where the sort of ground zero of this in Europe, and people spread across to Austria, Switzerland, Germany, Iceland, UK, Norway, Sweden, Canada, Spain, Portugal, and France, just to mention a few there. At that point, we had seeded most of Europe and parts of North America. So I think we were pretty much done at that point with trying to shut the door. And I think there's an amazing quote, actually, which was put out at the time. If I can just quickly find that one, which is quite interesting. Computational biologist Trevor Bedford exclaimed Jesus during interview when she was told the total number of exported cases from China was 29, not 13. And she said, I think if it's not contained shortly, we're looking at a pandemic. So I think that expletive, that cry, cri de coeur, sort of was very apposite, because at that point we were done. It was out of the box. The genie was out of the box. And I think we can see about which countries closed down their borders fast and which did not. WHO was not advising closing the borders at the time. I think the islands have done extremely well. Micronesia's had no cases. New Zealand and Australia have done fairly well. Some of the other countries with larger borders, of course, more difficult to patrol, have done very badly. And hubs such as the UK, Netherlands, Belgium, some of these large hubs for migration have done extremely poorly. And potentially there's something specific about those populations as well, which has made them more susceptible to high death rates. Okay, so let's finish there with that little talk. And I want to go on to just say, before we get into the actual discussion around lessons learned, that actually we've done incredibly well. WHO said we wouldn't see any vaccines for 18 months at the start of this. And actually we had a vaccine, within 6 months, 8 months, if you count the ones outside China and Russia. I mean, that's a remarkable achievement, built upon platforms I know that were pre-existing, but at home, our Wendy Barclay and our Pfizer Johnson & Johnson partners across the pond have done incredibly fast work to produce something which has decreased hospitalizations, and you can get protection rates there of 94, 95%. I said at the time, it isn't going to happen for 18 to 24 months. I was wrong. I also said I didn't believe the second wave would be too severe. I was wrong. I think all of us here have probably been wrong about this, and maybe have also lost people to this disease, which is not a pleasant one, and we'll go into that. Okay. Yeah, in the background of that success story, we also have some other things which aren't so good. Back when it started, we had 82,000 daily cases globally, 8,000 deaths this time last year. Now we've got 600,000 cases and 10,000 deaths. So the deaths haven't gone up dramatically, although there was a peak, probably because we're treating better, but the cases are really quite enormous. So we've had remarkable and unprecedented success with vaccines, but we still have problems. But hopefully that decrease in death shows we have got some successes. So I want to start off really about talking about, are we guilty or not guilty, really, about not taking this seriously enough at the beginning? Did we make some bad calls as we commenced? Did we have malaise, disbelief? Did we have reticence to engage? What led to this situation now when, that Jesus comment was first stated? Could we at that point even have stopped it? So perhaps, Peter, I can go over to you and ask your opinion on that.
Well, thank you, Adrian. You've covered so much ground in that introduction. I'm wondering what is most relevant to add. I mean, I would say that the Chinese, almost controlled it. And we should remember the massive efforts they made. I know that at the moment, China has got some rather bad press internationally, but they did really, really respond once they appreciated what they had there. And I think we were all watching those raids as they came down in China and just hoping that there hadn't been so much international spread. And I do remember, as I was on my way back from a Gordon conference, seeing the news that it was out in not only in northern Italy, but also in Iran. And I thought, that's it, we're lost. There's no way that that's going back into the bag. I was just looking at the Academy of Medical Sciences report that we wrote last spring to see what it was that we had got right and hadn't got right. One of the things that we failed to predict was the enormous speed with which it was going to be possible to develop vaccines. I think that has been so remarkable, absolutely extraordinary. And so many vaccines, most of which prove pretty effective. Some more effective than others, and some not effective at all. So it was not an obvious thing that the vaccines would be possible to develop. I mean, looking at our report, we were pretty confident there was going to be a very big flu season, and we spent quite a lot of money and effort on vaccinating everybody going into last winter, not having quite appreciated that all the social isolation measures we're actually going to more or less abolish influenza. I think another thing that we didn't anticipate, looking back, was the frequency with which variants were going to emerge. At the time, we were talking about coronaviruses being pretty stable in terms of their genetics, pretty slow to evolve, that they had inbuilt mechanisms for correcting gene mutations. And I think we just didn't quite work out that we were going to see mutations first emerging because of greater transmissibility and subsequently because of evasion of the host immune responses. And I think that's a major thing that we were caught out by, was the emergence of those variants. I mean, I think we also didn't really appreciate just how important it was to launch rapid trials like the recovery trial that was run out of Oxford, testing different drugs. I personally was a bit doubtful that steroids were going to have a tremendously beneficial effect, and they actually, in moderate doses, have saved thousands and thousands of lives. And those trials, the big trials, the recovery trial and others, REMAP-CAP in particular, have been instrumental in telling us, what does work, and perhaps more importantly, what doesn't work, and which we ought to stop using because actually there's no clinical benefit. So, I think there's been a lot of surprises, but we haven't done so badly, I would say. I agree with Adrian. You know, we did a lot that was right, and it's just been an extraordinary year.
Thank you very much, Peter. That was great to have your insights. I want to try and keep this European first, and then I'll move over to Dan and to Dennis. So, Becky, what have you seen in Norway in terms of both the emergence, your expectations, and actually your outcomes?
Well, I think both you and Peter have covered very nicely the sort of total situation. In Norway, we were lucky that the first cases were not until our winter half term, and we had a woman prime minister who shut the country down very quickly. So initially, we had relatively few cases, even that stretched our healthcare system. And we had very decisive political action, which I think was really important in the initial control of the pandemic. But I think subsequently we perhaps became a little complacent, and we followed the European idea of opening borders. And now we're entering our third wave within Oslo, people being moved from one hospital to another because the intensive care beds are full. So we started very well, but I think the thing we've really learned is to expect the unexpected with this virus. I mean, every time we think we're one step ahead, we are always 2 steps behind. So I think it's been a challenging year. It's probably a year we will all remember for the rest of our lives. A lot of countries have made good decisions only to come a cropper later on. And for instance, the UK and the US have done very well on vaccination, whereas following the European model, we are at 11% vaccination rates now. So I think it's been an amazing year scientifically to see the global community really collaborating and coming together to find a suitable treatment, to develop vaccines and working together. But I think we really need to move forward on, equitable access to both medicines and vaccines.
Thank you very much, Becky. Very, very quickly, how would, I don't want to politicize this, but how would you say your difference in your responses to Sweden have made a difference? Briefly. Do you think there's been a difference between Norway and Sweden? Do you think Sweden, who were going for herd immunity, because we consider that in the UK, do you think that was really a pipe dream? That's all I'm asking, really.
Yeah, and that was to me, Adrian. That
question. Was, Becky, it was, yes.
Yeah, I was hoping it was to someone else. I think that for two countries that have quite similar healthcare structures, although the way that they are set up is what has ultimately been different. In Norway, it was a political decision to shut the country. The health experts would not have shut the country. We shut down on the 12th of March and we had our first case on the 26th of February. So we shut down very early. Whereas in Sweden, the health experts are responsible for the decisions. We have seen that they have at least 10 times the death rate of Norway. So I don't need to say more than that, I think.
No, exactly. And I think we should be very careful that we cannot cast aspersions on any particular country for their actions. They have very difficult political situations quite often and social differences, which means some people are more accepting of that than others. And we can see that Germany, although it's been quite strict around its track and trace and it's closing its borders, etc., still continue to have increasing rates of infection, even currently. So you do wonder what the other contributory factors are. I don't think there's a right or wrong thing when you start a pandemic. It's the world's biggest experiment that's going on. So Dan, in that context, the US was a bit slow to shake the dust off its heels and get started, but by God, when it did, it certainly got going, and I think it's third now. I think after Israel and the UK, it's roaring up behind us.
Well, I would agree with everything that's been said so far. I would also add that we were extrapolating, which made sense from what we know from other pathogens, other respiratory viral pathogens, especially influenza. And we overestimated the idea that symptomatic infection was most transmissible. It probably is the most transmissible, but it's not the only way to transmit this virus. And that was an underestimate that we really suffered from, I believe, in terms of having a lot of asymptomatic cases that resulted in transmission of this infection. It also led to a lot of miscommunications about masks or no masks, and when to mask and all that, particularly in the United States. Say second, there was political interference with public health practices, and that really got in the way of doing the best we could in the beginning, which made the pandemic get out of control in a number of countries, including ours. Third, we had this debate between whether or not we should focus on the public health or should we focus on the economy? And I think you can't separate them. You have to think about them in an integrated fashion. And you really need to focus on the public health measures to be able to get the economy back on track faster.
Yeah, I think that's very well put. And I think that's been an abiding theme with the US. They've wanted to balance the economy with the healthcare priorities or paradigm in the US, and that's a balance each country has to find on its own because it has its own pressures. So Dennis, I expect you've been remarkably busy. You know, we've had 125 million cases as of today, 33 million deaths, 100 million recovered. Cases are still climbing, Russia, Hungary, Mexico, Ukraine. I mean, it ain't over yet, and we've got new variants knocking at the door. So what have you noted since possibly the beginning and now? Are you seeing changes maybe in pathology?
I mean, I've got to agree with Dan as far as the misinformation and the sort of division of opinions as far as priorities over the pandemic. As far as in the healthcare setting, in the hospitals, you had two things that I'd like to point out. In as far as developing testing, the regulatory aspects of that and the regulatory hurdles for developing testing was for the FDA was it caused a bit of a delay in getting tests online. And then once we did get them online, of course, you still got to run your regular tests, your usual work for your hospital patients. And now you've got all the COVID testing on top of that, which is causing burnout among lab staff. Okay, so that's the one thing. And then the other thing is there were a lot of areas in the bigger cities that had a lot of patients. Hospitals became overrun, and you had to cancel or delay other procedures in order to care for those patients, which I think will have an effect later. And then in other areas, that smaller areas, I'm in Wisconsin, in sort of rural areas of Wisconsin where you've only got one hospital. It only took a few patients to, overload those hospitals as well. So it kind of highlighted a deficiency in the healthcare setting in as far as our ability to handle a pandemic like this. So that's something I think we need to learn from.
Yeah, and I think the UK is the same. Look at the scramble for PPE, sort of some profligate spending. Running out of toilet rolls is not the worst thing in the world when you don't have enough respirators. And I think that was another issue. And I think that panic, which we should have really, along with CEPI and the WHO, and we did have a pandemic preparedness plan. It was all very well. And there were bonds, WHO issued bonds for all this. So we actually had pandemic bonds to pay for all this, which haven't paid out, bizarrely enough. But there are thresholds. We should have possibly been slightly less, I wouldn't say panicked, but maybe diverted by some of the smaller issues. And we should have possibly not have had those supply issues quite as badly. But then the world's a lot bigger place when some of these plans were made, and it's a lot more politically diverse. So I think that may have led to some of those issues. Okay, I'd like to go on to adverse events, which I think is really going to be a good thing to dig into, because we've seen changes in, let's talk about IFR, which we probably think is anywhere 0.4, 0.6 up to 0.9%, depending on which countries you're looking at. CFR was originally somewhere between 2.6 to 3.4. It's now stabilized about 1.4%. We know the CFR is always going to be slightly wrong. Case fatality ratios. What's a case? You've tested it. It's a case. A lot of those, 40% at least, are going to be asymptomatic. Maybe 50%, 60% you're never even going to see because they're mild, maybe higher. So it makes it very difficult to calculate. But during that time, have a quick look at what we thought what would have turned out to be very good indicators. Obviously counts around your neutrophils, lymphocytes, just generally white blood cells. We know that D-dimer and ferritin have been touted. Certainly D-dimers and APTT still there. IL-6, obviously. IL-10 was certainly, it's becoming more interesting. I think a lot of people are talking about IL-10 and CL10 as well. We're talking about prothrombin times, and I don't think that's too, doesn't take too much imagination to think if you're affecting the ACE2 and therefore your angiotensin pathways, etc. It's not too surprising that that's being affected. C-reactive protein, possibly IL-6, and then the other, normal markers you might look at for mortality and morbidity, which are going to be obesity, heart disease, COPD, the usual suspects of upper respiratory tract infections. So given that in mind, and that brief romp about what we thought from the Wuhan data, really right at the beginning, were going to be predictive. Are they still predictive? And has that led to, having those markers, has that led to improvements in our therapies? And again, over to you, Peter, because I know you've been at the forefront of quite a lot of that.
Well, I think I'd add, we, from our studies of several thousand people hospitalized in the UK, we had a paper in Science Immunology a few weeks ago, which put GM-CSF very centrally. And I think that sort of fits in with this being a very sort of angry macrophage disease, rather than being a disease which is predominantly what you might call a cytokine storm. The cytokines are raised, but a lot of them are raised rather modestly compared to the situations that are classically described as cytokine storms.
I would agree with that. And if I quickly jump in, if we look at the interventions we're making with some of our antibodies in terms of IL-6, it doesn't seem to be as effective as we sort of hoped it would be. In fact, that data is really, really woolly. Does it help? Doesn't it help? Does it help with or without these corticosteroids? So maybe dampening down the whole system is better than pulling logs out of the fire, because you just start burning somewhere else.
It's a perpetual problem. I mean, back in 2009, I remember going to see Mark Warport at the Wellcome Trust to get the funding for the Mosaic study of influenza. And Mark said, look, Peter, I've had enough of observational studies. I don't want you just to go and observe stuff, do something. And the question is, what could be done? What was it ethical to start trying to intervene with? And I do think it's been remarkable to see interventions properly assessed with things like tocilizumab and other IL-6 pathway blockers, defining really what the utility of those is and whether you need to use it in different phases of disease. And I think that's been extraordinary to be able to see the detail of when things like tocilizumab do work and when they don't work. Having to use it relatively late in people who are already hypoxic, for example, and relatively little effect early, whereas other things like the antibody therapy, when it works at all, seems to be if you use it relatively early in disease. And dexamethasone, wonderful discovery because of the availability of steroids and it being a class effect. So I think all of these are really good. I think there is further to go in terms of immunomodulation. And of course, from our results in the ISRIC study, we're very keen to see more data on blocking the GM-CSF and associated pathways, and whether that will find a place in addition to steroids and anti-IL-6 is to be determined, I say.
Yeah, I think, look at bamlanivimab, the Eli Lilly combo that came out, which just targets spike protein and tries, RBDs. They're failing, especially against the new variants. And even the FDA said, okay, well, maybe we'll move over to something else. And the Regeneron casirivimab combo, again, is now being preferentially used in early treatments, prior to hospitalization, and still, has an effect. But these may decrease. And I think you're right that actually this is an inflammatory disease, which isn't necessarily a simple cytokine cascade like people said it was. I think it's more subtle and nuanced than that. And I think we are learning a lot from repurposing drugs. What saved us here, not the new drugs, but the repurposed one, remdesivir being repurposed. We're seeing dexamethasone being repurposed. Okay, some of the other ones we tried to repurpose, some of the malarial drugs and antiparasitics have not been quite so successful. But Dan, in the US, there was a rush towards various repurposing. Do you think that helped, or do you think that slowed possibly the efficacy of the research that was going on?
I certainly think it helped. I think it was important to start off looking at, does something work better than nothing? And demonstrating that remdesivir did significantly shorten the course of illness was an important finding, but it's nowhere near enough. It didn't have a significant effect on mortality. Dexamethasone has prevented mortality. But it's still, we don't have any home runs at this point, or anything that we can really count on to salvage all of our patients. So it's, in my mind, still pretty disappointing where we are with treatment. And I think that our best strategy is, right now at least, to focus on vaccines and getting people vaccinated, because that's the best way that we can prevent most of the morbidity and mortality. We haven't gotten to the long haul symptoms yet, but that's also something that should be prevented by vaccination. So I'm a stalwart for vaccination. Of course, I'm biased because that's what I do, but I see that as the major impressive response so far that is providing hope to the world.
Yeah, good point. Good point. Becky, Dan touched on what we call long COVID now. I quite like long COVID because it makes something which is pretty horrendous sound quite acceptable, doesn't it? Whereas if you talk about severe sequelae or something like that, it always sounds very, very unpleasant. But I mean, these are real issues in terms of continuous symptoms of fatigue, malaise, brain fog, loss of sense of smell, though that's usually quite short, taste and smell. But other things, arthralgias, rashes. I mean, this is the whole, I found 84 different symptoms of COVID disease associated with either acute or long COVID. What do you think we've learnt in this year about the ability of infectious disease to cause a whole range of sequelae downstream that were unexpected? What sort of hit you in the face and you've gone, wow, that's a bit weird?
I think what would be the most worrying here is, whilst one might expect that ICU patients and hospitalized patients would have long-term complications, I think seeing the spectrum of long-term complications in quite high proportion of community cases is what would worry me the most. And in young people, children, they often just have disturbance of taste and smell, but anyone over the age of 15, 16 seems to also be susceptible to very long-term complications. And so we have to look at this as beyond just, a cold type illness. It is a complicated illness. And with the long-term complications, there's going to be an enormous health burden in years to come. So I mean, this is really, as Dan says, it's really, really important now that we get up the vaccination rates and that we get up production, and accessibility of vaccines so that we can actually protect people from the long-term complications.
Thank you very much. Dennis, I mean, I'll throw it to you because testing is going to be critical in this, isn't it? I mean, we not only need to know who's had the disease in case of these long-term sequelae. I mean, those may be coagulative disorders, we've seen DIC, but also long-term shedding, which has been a problem. I mean, it's not as bad as Ebola, where an outbreak's come from someone who was carrying it for 5 years and spread it sexually. I mean, wow, if we get something like that in our systems, we are in deep, deep trouble. But this is bad enough. I mean, Dennis, what do you think about testing? What can we do about testing for some of these long-term symptoms?
I mean, I think there needs to be a better system to make testing more available, which I know the government is working on now. And they need to do more, they're doing the testing and you've got, positive or negative, but you need to take and sequence more of those positive cases, when it, start talking about variants and things like that. And that I think is going to be important for the long term as well.
Yeah, I mean, we don't need to test to know if you're male or female or
right.
your blood group A, for example. You don't need to test for obesity, But there are other things there which are markers which maybe we can look at, which will give us an idea of propensity towards these long COVID conditions. Are you seeing anything coming through which we're saying, I mean, anybody here, I'm seeing something coming through that says, yeah, if you've got that, you're more likely to have long-term symptoms? I mean, I've got a few ideas, but what do people think?
I don't think there's any direct correlation that you could say this equals that. It's quite a span of variation.
Yeah. Okay, well, let's zip across to vaccine efficacy, because that's, the buzzword. And I'm a bit confused, because vaccine efficacy is being measured in lots of different ways. Vaccine efficacy is different between different variants. But at the end of the day, we have a vaccine efficacy which stops people dying. So, I mean, let's just draw the line under that. If you want a vaccine immediately to stop people dying, we've got it. In fact, we've got 12 vaccines that have been authorized. I think we've got something like 83 in clinical, and we've got 170 something in preclinical. So we've got a hell of a lot of vaccines coming through. Vaccine efficacy. Did we expect we'd see this sort of efficacy based upon the platforms we've seen before? 61% roughly, if you're looking at H1N1 for influenza. Personally, I said, you'll be lucky if you get more than 60%. Am I wrong? Dan, let's have a you on this one.
Well, I think everyone was very, very pleasantly surprised by the results of the initial efficacy studies looking at severe disease and symptomatic disease infection. We never expected to have 94, 95% efficacy with the first try. So that is an amazing tribute to all the efforts during this past year and a half, but also all the work that's gone into developing the platforms for vaccination and advancing ways to more rapidly develop vaccines. It is, I think, good news that we are seeing more and more information indicating that the vaccines prevent asymptomatic infection. And that is likely, of course, we have to be careful with our extrapolations, but likely to translate into reduced transmission from people that have been vaccinated. So that's also a great thing. It is confusing looking and comparing between the different vaccines and thinking about the different efficacy levels that have been seen with the different platforms. And I think it's part of the confusion is that we're not in a static pandemic. We're in a pandemic that is evolving as we speak. And as that happens, it may become harder and harder for vaccines to protect against the new variants of concern that are learning to escape at least some of the neutralizing antibody responses. So it's unfair in my mind to directly compare numbers of efficacy between the earliest vaccines, the mRNA vaccines that hit the 94, 95% efficacy level compared to those that were studied a bit later and more broadly in the world, and particularly in South Africa, which has led to maybe bigger challenges for vaccine efficacy.
Yeah, we're seeing deaths fall. Globally, we're seeing deaths fall as vaccines get rolled out. And those countries with the higher vaccination rates, you're seeing those falls which are greater. I mean, Norway, 14.4%, UK, 45, 46%. I mean, these just reflect vaccine access and the different programs. But whether you see 14 or 45%, you're still seeing dramatic reductions in death. And, who doesn't want to see that? I mean, that's a great place to be. So as I mentioned, Norway, Rebecca, and I'm not picking on Norway, please understand that. I just think we need to have different perspectives. Vaccine efficacy, from the beginning of the pandemic to now, could you ever have predicted we'd see such incredible developments? Or like me, were you completely wrong and said it's going to be 2 years?
I have been pleasantly surprised. So I'm delighted with the fact that vaccines have been developed so quickly and they've been made accessible so quickly. So it really is a scientific great achievement. So I'm delighted with that. But I think, as you mentioned, Norway, where we've had a very low case fatality rate, under sort of 0.5%, then we have to look at the adverse events, and we are a country that now has extended today the use of AstraZeneca. We need to extend that beyond the period now to decide about adverse events. So moving forward, I think it's really important that we have good communication about vaccines, that they are saving lives and they are preventing infection. We can expect adverse events, and we have to then decide what is an acceptable level of adverse events. So I think one of the key criteria for us to move ahead is that we have good communication moving ahead. And coming from a country that has had relatively low infection rates, of course, then the adverse events are weighed quite heavily against, we haven't had a lot of deaths. So I think moving forward, we need to have greater access to vaccines, and we need a really good, solid communication strategy to ensure that people do take the vaccines, because it is our way out of this dreadful pandemic.
I think data's been our savior and our curse in this. I mean, that's 37 cases and 17 million inoculations, something like that. And the EMA said, hey, look, this isn't above chance. So I don't think we have any really good data yet that says there's anything to worry about. Peter, I'll let you have a quick comment on that. I'm not throwing you on the fire here. It's just data here really is essential, isn't it?
Absolutely. And I think the way in which it's been communicated has been quite obviously vital. I think the amount of public communication that's gone on in the UK through TV, newspapers, radio, so on, that's been hugely beneficial in terms of getting public confidence up in terms of vaccines. The communications by AZ, I must say, have been pretty disastrous, haven't they?
Yeah.
With so many different wrong footings, and that's been very detrimental. I mean, amongst an audience of pathologists, I think one of the most interesting things has been this link with coagulopathy, both from the disease, but now also, showing this signal which we don't quite understand from the vaccine. So what's going on here? Is this something to do with the spike protein in some way triggering events which lead to an endovasculitis and a coagulopathy, or what is going on? I think that this is something which should be of enormous interest to the pathologist community in terms of trying to sort out the basic mechanisms. It is clearly something which we need to understand so much better in order to explain both the disease and also the potential adverse effects of vaccines. And I think we need to be straightforward and honest about this. When we don't know, we need to say we don't know. On the other hand, I would also point out that the fact that these quite rare events have been given such prominence and have been discovered so rapidly shows that the system is working, and that the way in which we're detecting adverse events is effective. So, I think there's many good messages to get out there, but the question is, are we communicating them properly?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think you're right that we've got a lot of unknowns about what happens to ACE2 binding with a spike antibody coming along. Are we potentiating things there? It's an endothelial disease, are we somehow stimulating that, especially in those who may have had COVID before? These are now primed T cells, primed B cells. I mean, there is some anecdotal evidence that if you've had COVID previously, your vaccine may give you more severe adverse events. I wouldn't be at all surprised. So I think last thing on that is the rollout of fair and equitable access. And I really don't want to politicize this again, but something we've got to learn from this is how we've seen the BRI from China, we've seen Russia's Sputnik 5. We haven't seen the advanced respiratory disease or enhanced respiratory disease, which we were potentially seeing from these inactivated or subunit vaccines. That fear has been unfounded, I hope. So maybe we are, 8 of the current authorized vaccines are from China and Russia. The other 4 are from the Western countries. Are we seeing a more fair and equitable production rollout now? And is this beneficial to all, or as the majority of vaccines seem to have gone to wealthy Western countries in terms of numbers. Have we still got some way to go? So that's a very quick one. I'll chuck over to Dan. I don't want to dwell on it too long, but Dan, do you want to give us a quick comment on that, about how we possibly get access better? And does it stem right back to the beginning where we didn't scale up quickly enough?
Yeah, I think it also, it does relate to that we didn't scale up rapidly enough. And we also didn't have a coordinated response by WHO, by certainly in the US, our federal government in the beginning. And that had really slowed us down in terms of getting the rollout done. There's a lot of pressures, of course, in a country that has means to vaccinate their own public. There's also the need to be thinking about this as a global health problem, which a lot of other people are at risk for. And it's not only for the benefit of others that we should be sharing the vaccines with the world, but it's important for those of us that do have more means, in that since it's a global pandemic, it's so infectious and can spread so quickly that if we have pockets of this anywhere in the world, they can cause a resurgence, especially as the virus mutates and may escape the immunity that's induced by the current vaccines.
Sure, and I think that brings us on to our next point, which I think is probably one we've all been holding our breath on, which is new variants of interest and variants of concern. So we've probably got 4 variants of concern. We've got about 6 interest. There seem to be some convergent, there are more, but if we bring them down to the escape mechanisms and mutations, that's probably about right. We saw an early 614 change, then we saw the 501 turn up. Now we've got the 484. There's possibly some interferon escape. We may be seeing certainly 70% more transmission with the B117, possibly 1.6 times death rate, although that again varies between papers. I mean, these variants, they have the potential to cause huge numbers of problems for us. I'll go over to Dennis. In terms of spotting these, we can do some testing now quite quickly if we make our primers correctly, where we very quickly can actually spot these coming up, these variants, and actually identify them within our routine testing rather than having to do the old days sequencing or probing. Do you think that's going to help us?
Yeah, I think it will help us. I mean, I haven't seen a lot of this where I am, but I think the fact that you can rapidly adjust your testing, it will help to spot these. But again, you have to then sequence these samples and to better track where these variants are.
Yeah, and I think we're seeing that at various places like Africa and Nigeria and South Africa, rather, and Nigeria, starting to put these sequencing centers together as they realize that. I'll go across to Peter, because you've done quite a lot with these new variants. We've got the B117, 501, V2, B11248. These are worrying because they do escape from, they seem to be more infectious. They can, from nerve tags, seem to suggest that you've got an increased risk of death. Seems to be some loss of effectiveness, certainly against the monoclonals. I mean, one of them escapes, Brazil one can escape a large number of the monoclonals. Do you think our next generation of vaccines have really got to be, it's a bit of an obvious question, but our next generation of vaccines have got to be about breaking transmission as well as recruiting death, and really concentrate on actually stopping replication of this virus?
Yeah, I think it's going to be so interesting from the virological point of view to watch how this plays out. I mean, I think it is a bit like a game of chess. You see the pieces moving on the board, and sometimes it looks like a pawn or relatively easy to knock out. Sometimes you get something which a piece which can travel further, and suddenly it looks like it's threatening your queen or your king. And then you get these knight's move mutations that you just think, where did that come from? I mean, I hope that, you know, as the game progresses, you know, we'll be able to outsmart the enemy, and as the chessboard becomes depleted of pieces, you know, there will be fewer places for this virus to go. I mean, clearly, it is mutating now, not only to transmit better, but also to escape mutation. And, you know, where will it end? Will it end up as one of our regular common cold coronaviruses that you acquire in early childhood and it's relatively mild, and then you have some lifelong immunity? I guess many of us sort of suspect that may be what we're going to be observing in real time over the next few years or decades. But in the meantime, I think we're going to have to update our own vaccines in order to try to anticipate and nip these mutants in the bud. I mean, from the point of view of the immunologist, you know, to what degree are we going to be hidebound by original antigenic sin? You know, having committed the immune system to a particular path, is it going to be easy for the modified, updated vaccines to then deviate to a new track? That's all to be played for. Going to be very interesting times, but I do believe that we can science our way out of this.
I like that. I like that. I believe that too. Becky, okay, look, we had the B117, 1351, P1 turned up in September 20, October 20, December 20. Now, look, there's some convergent evolution going on there. So I think there are certain obvious backdoors they're using. Okay, so I think that's why they're predominating. Now, considering the 614G turned up around about February in 2020, and by April it was not just predominant, but it was almost, you know, entirely dominating. Do you have a feeling that one of those is going to dominate and that's going to be the basis of our next vaccine? I mean, take a guess.
You're asking me the impossible, aren't you, Adrian?
All the questions I've asked you so far have been impossible. I don't. It seems very mean. Anyway, please give us your learned answer.
Well, I mean, clearly we have an immense infection rate throughout the world, and the virus is evolving very rapidly to try and continue to spread. So I think until we get down the total, you know, global infection rates, we are going to be one step behind. I mean, I had actually a question almost for Peter with the British mutant, with or the variant of concern, with it being better adapted and probably having higher viral loads. Do you think we're going to see more complicated long-term symptoms? And do you think with the new variants, I'm turning the question around, maybe I should ask you, Adrian, do you think we're going to see more long-term complications? Because to my mind, you know, the higher the viral load, perhaps the more complications one will have long-term. I don't know. I was throwing that out.
Very quickly and hand it to the expert, who's Peter. I would suggest we're not, because these mostly are around immune evasion, like interferon, 14 different interferons and pathways are deflected or evaded by some of these mutations. That's got to make it more pathogenic because it can replicate more. Therefore, it will attach more. Therefore, blah, blah, blah. So yes, I think they will become more pathogenic. Do I think a new range of symptoms will come out? No. Do I think the severity will be worse? Possibly. Do I think we can stop that with a vaccine? I think fairly quickly. So I'm not as concerned as possibly others are, because the platforms have proved very effective. Now, Peter, you give me a clinician's view of this.
Yeah, I mean, I desperately hope and sort of expect that the delayed complications will be lessened by vaccines, even if they predominantly induce a systemic response, because I'm assuming that the virus somehow has to go systemic to create a lot of the problems that we're seeing with so-called long COVID. I mean, in the Hoft study that was put up as a preprint yesterday, the major predisposing factors are being female, often sort of young middle-aged female, predisposing factors, particularly obesity. So it's not just those who are getting very high viral loads. There is a distinct cluster, which is the post-ventilator ITU long COVID. But in the Hoft study, and also actually in the ISRIC4C, we identified 4 different types of disease, which you could lump together and call them all, you know, a variety of long COVID. So I think to my mind, it would be a big surprise if vaccination doesn't really have a major effect in reducing those long-term sequelae. Because I assume, yeah.
Sorry, very quickly after Dennis. I mean, are we going to have to monitor glycosylation? I always struggle with that, glycosylation a lot more closely, because there seems to be a very strong link for so many different things with glycosylation and its effect on immune function, whether it's dysregulation of your immunoglobulins or disruption of your capillaries. You know, having too much sugar, being hyperglycemic seems to be a really bad marker for so many diseases. I mean, and this one, again, it's come around and said, you know, it's bad. We've got to do better in terms of our pancreatic fitness.
Well, that one's actually, that's a bit out of my range, I think. But yeah, I think there still are a lot of things that are unknown that we will need to monitor. And that is probably one of them.
Yeah, I think what it's told us that the more obese countries seem to have done worse than the less obese countries. And you can plot it, you know, and it's a bit worrying. But it does show that in the last few years, the wealthier countries, you know, you have that wealth at a cost, and that may be health. Okay, let's just jump over to, sorry, Dan, I want to skip you on that one, but I want to make sure we keep to time. I just want to talk about some of the economic impacts over the last year. I mean, so many people have been furloughed. I think we had 7.9 million people furloughed in the UK. 30% of those are just in London. It's been very, very bad. OECD has said the economic output isn't actually quite as bad as I hope. It's striking cautiously optimistic notes. When everyone says that, it means that it's hopeful rather than realistic. GDP growth forecast it's probably upward more than 1% from December, 5.6% globally, with recovery of 4% growth in 2022. I mean, house prices have never gone down. They've gone up, even while the economy's been pitching down, with real effects on hospitality and travel. And I know people in the travel industry. I play football with a bunch of them, and half of them have just lost their jobs. Bang, gone. What do you see in terms of pandemic effects? What have we learned? What have we learned in terms of putting money aside for this, actually preparing? WHO shares in this pandemic one haven't paid out. We haven't hit the threshold. We seem to have had very large funds. World Bank promised 20 billion straight away to try and support this. I mean, there's been a lot of effort, but can we afford pandemics? I think is the question I'm asking. Not you personally, Dan, as a country, can we afford a pandemic? As a global economy?
Well, I think we can afford it better or easier if we can stop it earlier. So early public health measures would be very important. I think also in terms of the economic havoc that this pandemic has created, it's largely, or most, the worst effects have been on the lower rungs of the economic spectrum. So people that already have suffered disparities, already are going from hand to mouth, from day to day, just getting by. They don't have health insurance in the United States. They don't have the luxury of being able to take off from work if they are working, because they don't get those benefits. So it's really just strongly amplified, at least in my mind, and I think many people's minds, that we have to have a system that can be ready to prevent that further widening of disparities in healthcare in places like the United States, because they are the ones that have suffered the most from the economic consequences of.
Can I just shout that across to Peter again? I don't want to concentrate on you, Peter, but again, there's been some interesting work out there. Your Imperial Group's been part of, is looking at disparities in sort of ethnicity and severe outcomes in hospitalization, where it would appear, if you look at it as just a surface eagle-eye view, it looks like ethnicity is a very big factor, a risk factor to hospitalization. But if you dig into it, it looks like possibly there's other underlying issues there about access to healthcare, ingrained poverty, ingrained vaccine hesitancy, a number of issues which may be associated more with a socio-economic than actually an ethnic rationale for this. I mean, what's your take on that? Because I didn't expect to see an ethnic, because I didn't expect to be an HLA difference, like, which would help this or affect this rather. But now I look more deeply into it, it does look like there are other far more cogent factors that may be doing it. Sorry, back to you.
Yeah, no, I quite agree with Dan that it's to do with disparities in healthcare and opportunity and crowding and multi-generational families and low vaccine uptake. It's all those things which conspire together against people who are part of different ethnic minorities. But in terms of the genetics, the Kenny Bailey in Edinburgh has been leading some brilliant studies on looking at the genetic polymorphisms that affect severity, particularly in intensive care, and came out with a beautiful paper in Nature not too many months ago now, which I think is really groundbreaking, but none of that appears to be ethnically clustered. So I think, absolutely agree with Dan that it's to do with all those other factors.
Yeah, and I think, potentially we're going to have 2 more hidden pandemics come out of this, which are going to hit us very nastily. One of those is social inequality, which this is highlighted. We need to address that. I mean, that's very clear on this. Mental health is one of these issues, although suicides don't appear to be raised, or they have sort of gone up and down depending on initially not. There was that kind of collaboration, we're in it together, which faded. Second one, there's been a slight rise. Japan's seen quite a lot of additional deaths to suicide. But I think the other one is missed appointments, hospital appointments. We are going to see increased, I mean, Dennis, maybe you can quickly talk on that. There are going to be extra people who are going to die because they didn't have myocardial issues or they didn't have oncologic issues investigated early, and they are going to come back to bite us in terms of excess deaths. Dennis.
Right. Yeah. There was several months where they called them elective procedures were canceled. And so you had all your screening tests, your colonoscopies, your mammographies, things like that. They were not happening. And there's a lot of concern. Is that going to cause an increase? Is cancer incidence going to go up in the next couple of years because of that delay? The other part is people who were already diagnosed, who maybe it wasn't an emergency surgery, but they had to wait. So now you've got cancer cases at a higher stage than you would have had, worse prognosis, things like that. I've seen a couple of papers already come out about this concern. Not a lot of data just yet, but it is a concern about that among the pathology community for sure.
Excellent. Okay, I want to sort of do one last thing before we close out, and everyone's got meetings. I want everybody to come up with their possible next 3 pandemic candidates. Now, I'll kick it off by saying morbilliviruses. I think they're a problem. We're seeing them transfer more and more between animal species and possibly into humans. I think measles might come back if we see more vaccine hesitancy. And measles, it's got an R value of 15, 16. If we think this is bad, you want to see measles get going. And then, the neurological complications of those are very, very severe, SSPE, etc. What else do I think? Well, obviously bird flu. Everyone is waiting for an H7, an H9 or an H5 to turn up and cause absolute havoc. So let's go round the table, and on my screen I can see again, Peter, you're next. What are your top 3? This is fun, okay? We're going to be enjoying this.
Right. I mean, so you're talking about which viruses we ought to be afraid of. I mean, I do think that the Ebola and so on that really continue to be very scary, and obviously the various influenzas. Yeah, but I mean, this is, I think. What we weren't anticipating quite was where this was going to come from and how it might differ from the last pandemic that we suffered. Maybe that was an issue.
I think zoonotic diseases are a worry per se. Bats carry almost more disease than any other animal. If you wanted to be, say, Adrian, which animal do you not want to pick up? I would say a bat. So I think that's possibly, a lesson for us all. Stay away from the bats. The bat cave is a bad place. So, Dan, what do you think about, what are your top 3 worries keep you awake at night in terms of your next pandemic?
Well, I would say that I'm very worried about another coronavirus outbreak. I think that it's happened 3 times in the last 20 years. The third one spread all the way around the world. The other 2 also could have. It's going to happen again. So I think we need to worry about coronaviruses and think about ways in advance of developing vaccines that have more of a universal activity. But there's a lot of issues there, as already brought up, like original antigenic sin, cross-reactivity with the common cold viruses, and what are you going to target? Maybe T cells responses might be covered.
I should put you would be the same.
I had to get that in there somewhere.
For a week.
Second, I'd say yes. I don't know about bird flu. Yes, that's certainly a big risk. We spent 20 years here developing stockpiled vaccines that haven't been used and probably won't be useful in the future. But a zoonotic influenza coming in and causing a worldwide outbreak of a completely new strain that hasn't been in people before certainly has to be the top list. And I'd agree with Peter that we have to worry about Ebola and other hemorrhagic diseases that fortunately they've been so severe that that helps with their containment, especially because of where they've been happening mostly. But I think that those, if they learn to be a little milder but still maintain similar virulence and transmitted in even more easy ways, that is very scary to me.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think the old adage is better to burn out.
Add it forth really quick. Okay. I would say I'm worried about all the world pandemics. For example, TB in India, when it's already being predicted that we're going to have 25% more cases and deaths because of COVID. So these things are here and we can't forget about it.
Well, as a microbiologist, I'd say AMR is mine, but anyway, let's move on from that. Okay. Becky, what are your top 3?
My top 3 that haven't already been said.
No, you can use them again if you want. Don't worry.
Well, I think coronaviruses, obviously. I mean, I'm hoping that this is our worst pandemic that we lived through in my life. I would say, yeah, the unknown zoonotic virus, and particularly another respiratory virus that is my biggest fear. Of course, flu, being a flu virologist, coronaviruses. Yeah, and I think we've really covered most of the virus, but it will be an unknown virus that we're not prepared for. So, if we turn it around, we need to think now. We need to think, how can we be better prepared? We need to think, One Health moving forward. We need to ensure that we have good surveillance in animal populations and that we are better prepared for the unexpected. I think that's what we should have learned from this. 2008,
there was a lot of investment in coronaviruses. It just stopped when the crisis hit. At that point, we already had this chimeric beta coronavirus, which would attach to ACE2. It was very interesting work going on. It stopped. So, but who could tell? Who could tell? Missed opportunities, sins and omissions. Dennis, would you like to give us?
Right. So I'm going to stretch this question a little bit. My answers are not infectious diseases, but the first, I think, is what I already mentioned about the possibly increased cancer incidence. I mean, I think if that actually does happen, that would be both economic and just social pandemic. I don't know if that's a thing, but so there's that one. The other thing is, and I mentioned earlier about the lab staff being overwhelmed, being burnt out. I mean, you talk about increased testing. You have to have people to do the testing, and we were shorthanded in most places around the country before this even happened. So that's something that has to really be looked at. There needs to be just more people, more training. And then the third thing I think Dan mentioned earlier about this is a global health crisis. It's global, and we have to think globally about it, about not only this, but whatever comes next.
Sure, and I think us talking today has shown we can get around those borders with, you know, intellectual conversations. Yeah, I totally agree in terms, Dennis, of oncologies. Tasmanian devil had that, was nearly wiped out by a facial tumor,
Right.
which transmitted through bites. We've had HPPV, you know, there are a lot of Epstein-Barr virus and Burkitt's lymphoma. I mean, there's a lot of oncolytic viruses out there. If we were to see something like that, and it's not just the direct loss of life, it's the loss. It's a bit like in the Second World War. They used to shoot, or the First World War, they used to shoot below the hip because they knew if they took somebody out, someone else had to pick them up and take them away. They didn't want them dead, they wanted them injured. And I think if you start seeing pandemics that cause such long-term issues, whether that be highly expensive treatments or long-term sequelae that disable large parts of the population, not directly, but also indirectly, you have to pay for them and you have to look after them, that could cause complete havoc. So yeah, maybe the ones that burn out are better than the ones that fade away. Okay. I want to thank everyone for their time today. It's been absolutely fantastic. I'm going to hand back to Michael Schubert, and thank you to the pathologist for hosting this. I think we've had a huge gamut of facts, possibilities, potentialities, and lessons learned from the past. And I hope that we've got a bright future with these new vaccines, which are looking better and better. We've got so many in the pipeline. We've got so many brains on it, and we've got so many platforms that are starting to really show their true potential, that actually I'm quite happy and content that our future is not as bleak as people would like to paint it. I think we'll come out of this, and I think we'll come out of it stronger because we'll have lessons learned. And if it happens again, it's not going to be 1918, and it's not even going to be 2019. Actually, you know, it's going to be a bit of a brighter future. So thank you to all.
Yeah, thank you all so much for your contributions to this fascinating discussion. It's pretty clear that the impacts of COVID-19 will be felt in innumerable ways and for generations to come. But as Adrian said, on the bright side, we can hope that the advances we've made in science and medicine will translate to better processes and better care for all of those who follow. But that's all we have time for today. So I'd just like to take the opportunity again to thank all of you and to thank our sponsor, Assuragen. So from everyone at The Pathologist, thank you for listening and stay safe.